So to introduce our topic of solving for x, I'm just going to talk about the rules. The first rule for solving for x is if there's any like terms, then you have to combine them. And if there's not any like terms, you skip right to step 2, which would be to isolate the variable, or variables, whatever there is. And to do this, you use addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division, depending on the problem. If it's subtraction, you cancel it out with addition. Multiplication, you cancel it out with division, vice versa. And then the third step is what you do to one side, you must do it to the other. So if you use addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division to one side, you have to use that same rule to the other side. And lastly, make sure you check your work. So the answer you get, plug it back in as the variable, and see if it comes out to the answer that it equals on the opposite side. Okay, so in this video we're going to give an introduction to Algebra 1 by solving for x. The first rule for solving for x is to combine like terms. So if you have a problem like x plus 5 equals 3, you're going to subtract the 5 from the side to get the x by itself because you have to isolate the variable. And you subtract 5 to this side because whatever you do to the side with the variable, you have to do to the opposite side. And it comes out to x equals negative 2. And if you want to test that, you just plug back in the equation negative 2 plus 5 equals 3. And negative 2 plus 5 does equal 3.
So whatever sign you see next to the x, when you're isolating it, you have to do the opposite. So if you're subtracting 4, you have to add 4 to the other side. So in this one, we would add 4 to here, x equals 9. Okay, so in this problem, we have to combine like terms first in order to isolate x. So since these two numbers are separate from each other, we have to put them together. So you would do 22 minus 4, since this is a negative sign. If it was a positive sign, then we would add it instead. But 22 minus 4 is 18. So then it ends up being 18 plus x. So just make it easier and condense. And then 18 plus x equals 18. You subtract the 18, just like in the other problems. And then x ends up being 0. Even though technically these two numbers aren't separated, they're right next to each other, it's still easier to combine them to solve the equation than to use them separately. So we do x plus 14 plus 16. 14 plus 16 is 30, equals 20. And just like all the other ones, subtract 30, and x ends up being negative 10.
So this equation, you notice, is a little different. Instead of like the other ones, they're not completely separated by addition or subtraction signs. Instead, the 4 is next to the x. And when the number is next to the variable in any case, it stands for multiplication. So in order to get rid of multiplication, you have to use division to cross it out. And the first step is just like the equations we've been doing recently. You subtract the 3 from both sides. And you have 4x equals 12. And so in order to fix this, like I said before, you use division. And that's going to x out the multiplication that's being done here. And of course, like usual, what's done to one side has to be done to the other. So you take the 4. And 12 divided by 4 is 3. And that's how you get x equals 3. So in this problem, you're still using division to get the answer in the end. And you start off the same way. You take the 6 and subtract it because you're adding it in the equation. And subtract it here. And you get 1/2 x equals 14. Okay, and then this is where it gets a little different since this is a fraction. And what you're going to want to do is multiply it by the reciprocal. So you just take the fraction being used and flip it. And since the 2's cancel out, you just keep it x. But whatever you do to that side, once again, you have to do this side. So you're going to times this by 2 as well. And you get x equals 28.
Okay, so in this equation we have an expression that's separated from a parentheses by another number. The parentheses in here means that it must be multiplied. But because this is isolated separately from this is one equation, and this is just the number must be multiplied by both of the expressions in the equation. So instead of just multiplying the 2 to the 2, you have to multiply the 2 to the 2, and you have to multiply the 2 to the 7. So you would multiply 2 by 2, which is 4, and you have to add the x at the end because the x goes along with the 2. And then multiply the 2 by the negative 7, which would make it a negative 14, equals 26. Then you just approach this like any other equation. You add the 14 to both sides. You get 40. Then 4x equals 40. Divide the 4 both sides, and x equals 10. Okay, so there's another way to approach the same equation where instead of multiplying the 2 to both parts of this expression, you can just divide the whole thing by 2 instead. Even though you're dividing the whole thing by 2, it only crosses out this 2 since this one is connected to the x and this is one big expression. You can't break it apart. And you can divide it by 2 because it's the reciprocal of the multiplication that you're doing up here to solve for it in this way. So this crosses out, and just like any other equation, you have to do the same thing to the other side. So you'd end up with 2x minus 7 equals 13. Then you go about it just the same. Add 7 to both sides, and then 2x equals 20. Divide both sides by 2 to isolate the x, and you get x equals 10. As you can tell, this equation is extremely messy, but in order to clean it up so that we could solve it, we have to consolidate a lot of the numbers. So, just like I told you before, all of these need to be distributed. So, we're going to distribute the 2 to this whole equation, making it 6x plus 14. And then we can't just add the 4, we have to distribute the 4 as well. So the 4 goes to the 3 and also to the 2. So it would come out to be 12x plus 8. Then we go to the next side and we distribute this whole thing too. So it would be 6 times 5 is 30, x, and then plus 6. And add the 2 at the end. Now we go back to combining like terms. So instead of just adding regular numbers, we're going to add numbers with the x's too. So only numbers with the x's can go together. So the 6x and the 12x can combine to become 18x. And the 14 and the 8 can combine like before and become 22. And then we add like terms together on this side as well, but since there's nothing to add to the x, it stays as 30, and the 6 and the 2 get added together to become 8. And then we have to put like terms together on the two sides in order to solve for just one x. Since the x is on both sides, we want to get it to just 1, so we're going to subtract one of the x's from one of the sides. I picked this one. Subtract 18x from here, and 18x from here as well. So this would become 12x plus 8 equals 22. Now we get rid of the 8 over here to isolate the x. 22 minus 8 comes out to 14. So now 14 equals 12x. Divide both sides by 12 to isolate the x. And we get x equals 14 over 12. And if we want to simplify this, we would divide both sides by 2, and we would get 7 over 6. So x equals 7, 6. So in this equation, we're going to solve for x a little differently. You can see that x is squared. So to start, you go about this equation basically the same as you do any other one. Subtract to get rid of the 5 on both sides. Come out to x squared equals 25. But you can't solve yet because the x is still squared. So to get rid of the squared, you have to do the reciprocal, which would be square rooted. But you have to do it to both sides. So we would get x equals the square root of 25. And then we know that the square root of 25 is 5, so x equals 5.
Okay, so in this equation, there's nothing that's independent. Everything is held underneath the square root, so the only thing you can do is get rid of the square root by squaring it. And squaring it x's out the square root because they're opposites of each other. And when you square that, you have to square the 3. And over here you get x minus 8. And the reason why it stays x minus 8 is because when you square it, it's only getting rid of the square root. It's not affecting the equation that's underneath it. So it equals 9. And then just as we did in the previous equations, you just add it, and you get x equals 17.
Thank you for watching. We hope this video was helpful.